Welcome to GrowthTV. I'm Carolyn Vallejo. These days, private equity firms and other investors have a wide array of partners they can work with to get a deal across the finish line, while also helping to meet their ESG and DEI goals. In Canada, First Nations are a growing presence in the investment community, and private equity firms have a unique opportunity to collaborate. Here with me to discuss their First Nation Fort McKay and its private equity fund are Monika Wilson, Vice President of Investments, and Stuart Randell, Chief Investment Officer. Monika, let's start with you. Could you introduce to us your First Nation and your fund?
Sure. Thanks, Carolyn. Really happy to be here today. So for those unfamiliar, Fort McKay First Nation is a small community comprised of approximately 900 Cree and Dene people. We're located just north of Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada. And for the American viewers today, First Nations in Canada is the term for a specific sovereign government, so similar to the Native American tribes you have in the US. So each year at Fort McKay, our annual budget to run the nation is upwards of $50 million, and this includes operational and capital expenses. And so the nation has the goal of becoming fully financially self-sufficient. And so to fund our annual budget, Fort McKay has decided to use profits derived from our companies. We've been in business since the 1980s, so for quite a while now. And when we got started forming oil service companies because of our location in the oil sands. And so these companies are still in operation today, and they're owned and operated by the nation. And it was around 2018 that the nation decided it really needed to diversify its business portfolio and not rely solely on the oil industry. And this was so our annual income can withstand commodity pricing fluctuations. And this was the beginning of our private equity fund, Fort McKay Landing LP, which I'll pass it over to Stuart to talk about.
Thanks, Monika. Yeah, so Fort McKay Landing is the investment firm that's owned 100% by Fort McKay First Nation. It's an income fund, and the profits from the portfolio companies flow back to the nation, where they provide approximately 50% of the operating costs for the year. And ideally, we hold these portfolio companies in perpetuity. It's an evergreen fund, which means each year Chief and Counsel tops up our capital to redeploy into new investments. Our average check size is about $3 to $5 million. For equity, sometimes we go up to 10, and then we add leverage on top of that. We'll take a position anywhere from 10 to 100%. We don't operate businesses, which means they need strong management teams in place, and we're really sitting on the board and acting as a shareholder and managing the investment from a portfolio standpoint. Currently, there's 13 businesses in the portfolio, and we're always looking for new ones. And so what we invest in is primarily industrial services. We do a little bit of real estate and a little bit of infrastructure, but what we're focused on is companies, primarily in trades, which are used to maintain assets and infrastructure in cities and plants. We do a little bit of light manufacturing. We look at that sector, and a little bit of professional services. And so there's this misconception that we only invest in Indigenous businesses, which is not true. We invest in any business, Indigenous or not, as long as it has a proven profitable track record of about 10 years. And geographically, we're US and Canada. Enterprise value, 20 to 30 million bucks is typically what we aim for on our own. 50 to 100 is what we do with partners, and we usually like to invest with other PE firms. And typically we do 4 to 6 deals per year, and we're always looking for new investments.
So I know that you're also interested in working with other private equity firms. Can you tell me a little bit about why they should work with your fund specifically, and why private equity firms should also consider working with Indigenous investors generally?
Yeah, great question, Carolyn. So we think there are 3 main differentiating factors which can compel other firms to work with Fort McKay Landing. So the first is that we take a minority position, unlike other PE firms. So it makes sense for PE to co-invest with us, as we can close a funding gap. And since we have access to an evergreen fund, we can close quite quickly. Second, since we're yield investors, we hold our investments long-term. And in our experience, this is quite attractive for management who are going to be staying to run the company. And third, there are competitive advantages to companies having First Nations owners. So corporate Canada and different levels of Canadian governments have set various Indigenous procurement targets, and they've started initiatives to increase what they called their Indigenous business spend. And so our team works with our portfolio companies to leverage this advantage and to grow sales and pursue contracts. To answer the second part of your question, the first compelling reason that firms should work with other Indigenous businesses is simply that there's so many of them. So right now, today, there are over 50,000 entrepreneur and First Nations owned businesses in Canada. So this is a growing and underserved market whose owners need to think about growth capital. They have to think about strategic acquisitions, mergers. There's a couple who have went public, but more are sure to follow. And these are founders who will one day have to think about exiting. So PE firms, investment banks, and advisory firms are uniquely positioned to offer these Indigenous businesses their services. And although Fort McKay Landing is the first private equity fund owned by a First Nation, I also suspect we will begin to see many other Indigenous communities begin to enter the PE and venture capital industries, both as professionals like myself and as fund managers like Fort McKay.
Now, ESG and DEI have, of course, become a big focus for many investors over recent years. How can working with a fund like Fort McKay Landing support investors' ESG and DEI goals?
Sure. So I can provide a couple examples. Typically, we're buying out founders or PE who's exiting the company. And so how we advance those goals, which are important to the nation, is first, once we take a position in a company, through the board and through our shareholder position, we mandate 10% Indigenous employment. That comes from Chief and Council. It's very important to the nation. And so 10% is what we have in all of our companies, and all of our companies have been able to achieve that. Second, the representation of Fort McKay Landing, our directors are Chief and Council, and they sit on the boards of these portfolio companies. They're Indigenous themselves, and they add that Indigenous representation and diversity to the board. And second, because Fort McKay, as Monika said, is the largest and the first, because of our interaction in the market, because we're buying companies, it really changes the perception of what First Nations can do as investors. And then lastly, there's an underrepresentation of women in our sector, which is PE, both from the advisory side, as well as on the boards and executive management teams. And the way we see this is there's a large untapped talent pool, which is not capitalized on. And so we see this as a missed opportunity. This is especially true for Indigenous women in executive leadership positions. So Fort McKay Landing, as well as Chief and Council, is really focused on promoting this talent pool, which is currently not engaged enough in the sector. And so that's how we're advancing those goals.
And I think when it comes down to it, when you think about ESG and DEI mandates, it's really about improving the lives of people or groups of people who have perhaps been marginalized or experienced oppression. And co-investing with First Nations, it fulfills any ESG and DEI mandate. You just have to come to the community, come see Fort McKay to see the tangible and really long-lasting impact that working with First Nations has on the people who live in the community. So the impacts to the community of Fort McKay have just been incredible. I'm a Fort McKay member myself. It's where I grew up, and I can honestly say this is my dream job because the investments that we make, they help ensure that everyone living in Fort McKay enjoys the same quality of life and standard of living that I think other folks across Canada take for granted. And in our experience, when a First Nation is able to achieve financial independence or financial freedom, this means that they can support their community members to pursue education and careers that they're choosing, to have access to culturally appropriate healthcare and services, and to be able to enjoy community infrastructure. And most importantly, now we have the freedom to express our culture, which at Fort McKay is our Cree and Dene culture. So it makes a big impact and it makes a very big difference.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So an opportunity here for not only successful investing, but to make a positive impact.